That's kind of conversation between the soul. That's conversation between the soul and the
Hello, Prestige Heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today, although it is for a grim reason, Gabriel Hetland. Gabriel's an associate professor of Africana, Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx studies at the University of Albany and author of Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn, which is about local politics in Venezuela and Bolivia. And of course, we've invited Gabriel to talk about what just happened in Venezuela. And just a note of disclosure, we are recording this evening on Saturday, January 3rd. So, these situations are always fluid. So just let everyone know. This will be out early morning on Sunday, East Coast time, but everyone should just know that. So Gabriel, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be with you, even though it's under, not so great circumstances.
Yeah, under strange, bizarre, and depressing circumstances, as this podcast is wont to explore. So, Gabriel, let's just jump right in. And maybe the first question that I'll ask is, on Saturday evening, what do we know about how this operation proceeded? I've seen multiple things about whether the Venezuelan military was involved, whether there was a backroom deal between the Trump administration and either the military or the opposition. But again, very fluid. But what do we know for sure, or what does it seem like is happening, and what is emerging right now?
Yeah, and I'm still getting caught up. As you said, it's a really fluid situation. But the first inkling I had that something unusual was happening was like 3 a.m. when I was, just up in the middle of the night and checked my phone and saw that there was bombing in Caracas, Venezuela. And then I woke up this morning, some hours later and saw that the U.S. had captured Nicolas Maduro as well as his wife, Celia Flores, who's the first lady in Venezuela and has been a pretty powerful figure. So I've seen reports that there was something like 150 U.S. warplanes that were involved, although I don't know the exact number of that. The latest reports I've seen suggest that there was something around 40 civilian and military casualties in Venezuela. So this was a U.S. military operation that happened overnight in Venezuela. There was some bombing of a military base and sort of airport, La Triunfa, in Caracas. And then I think the main civilian airport was involved in some bombing. I don't have all the details on what other targets might have been bombed. Trump said that they were basically taking out Venezuelan air defenses. There's also reports that there was a CIA operative that was in Maduro's inner circle. There's some speculation by people following Venezuela that some of Maduro's inner circle were involved at some point in some backroom dealings to basically give Maduro up to Trump in exchange for themselves staying in power. So it's really fluid. But what has happened right now for sure is that Maduro and Celia Flores, I believe they're getting close to New York City. They have been flown out of the country. They've removed from power.
They're in New York City. As we're talking. Yeah,
I heard terrible traffic on the West Side Highway from local informants.
Well, hopefully they can get an Uber or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then, Maduro's inner circle is still in power. So Delcy Rodriguez, who I think was, I can't remember if her latest position was a vice president, but she's held a variety of very high level positions within Venezuela. So she's the interim president. There's conflicting statements. She has issued fairly defiant statements in her own press conferences from Caracas, Venezuela. Trump and apparently Marco Rubio has said that they have been in contact with her, and she's basically said she's going to go along with what they're doing. Trump then had a fairly lengthy press conference where he said the U.S. is going to run Venezuela for as long as it takes. He said that they are not taking the options of boots on the ground out of the equation. So there's a possibility of U.S. troops on the ground in Venezuela, although as far as I know, that isn't the case right now, or there's a fairly minimal U.S. military presence there. And Trump was very open that Venezuelan oil was a major reason for this happening, although Marco Rubio tried to walk that back a little bit. But it seems clear that, there's been a change of power. Delcy Rodriguez is currently in office. Strangely, to some extent, Maria Corina Machado, who was the Nobel Prize winner a month or two ago, it has not been mentioned as a successor right now, and it doesn't appear that there's anything in the works to put her into office, or Edmundo Gonzalez, who's the one who
Trump openly rejected her. I mean, he
Right.
said she doesn't have the respect or the support within Venezuela to take power. And I can't help but wonder if he's pissed off that she won the Nobel Prize. Like, if she hadn't won the Nobel Prize, would he have handed the keys to her? I really don't know. I don't think anybody could say.
Yeah, I mean, he was upset for sure. I was following it really closely when she did win the Nobel Prize. He obviously, as everyone knows, was gunning for it himself. He really wanted it. And he and his associates were pissed right when it happened, and kind of made up with her, and she dedicated her prize to him publicly. She's backed all of his, murderous boat bombings in the Caribbean. She's backed his military interventionist rhetoric. It doesn't appear that she was directly involved or, spoken to about this operation, but it's kind of astonishing that she has been a major opposition figure that the U.S. government has supported for decades. And the fact that she wouldn't be sort of, not only not discussed, but actively rejected as a sort of possible successor to Maduro is really incredible right now. And it speaks to some animosity on the part of the Trump administration and Trump himself towards her, although, we're speculating on exactly what's going on, of course.
I mean, she's been hanging out a for sale sign. She's been going to conferences and talking about, we're ready to privatize everything that's not nailed down. Like, you can have it. Just please take out Maduro. That's what she's been doing, begging for this. And to have Trump just do it and then say, sorry, no, not you. It's going to be somebody else. It's just astonishing.
It really is. I think it speaks to the fact that probably people in Maduro's inner circle are also willing to do that. And I think we can say that with some fair confidence because Maduro himself is, on the record as being willing to give.
He was ready to do it, right.
He was ready to leave office.
To avoid this, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, he basically said, I don't want this to happen, so I will do anything that Trump wants, was my read of his statements in the last few months.
Exactly, including specifically and explicitly giving U.S. oil companies control over Venezuelan oil and basically U.S. government control over vast amounts of Venezuela's economy. At one point, there's reports that seem credible that Maduro offered to leave if he would get some security guarantees for himself and his family. Trump apparently rejected that, which is also kind of astonishing because he could have taken that as a win. I mean, it seems like he really wanted to remove Maduro against his will. And that, clearly is what happened overnight. There's a lot of weird stuff that is part of this, but there was a strong desire to have this, Trump removes Maduro piece of things.
So I'd like to, Derek, before we jump in, I want to take a bit of a medium-turn view because you've studied the so-called left turn in Venezuela and Bolivia and this thing that got going in the 2000s. And how would you place what happened now in sort of that medium-term history, if it's true that all of these leaders are essentially like, yeah, we're going to go back to the dollar diplomacy era. The United States controls the customs houses, or the 21st century equivalent of the customs houses. You control the natural resources, and let's go. If we're sort of thinking from a little bit of a higher perspective, what do you think is going on? What do you think it says about these longer-term trends?
Yeah. So, I mean, the pink tide happened in the early 2000s. So Chavez was, of course, elected in 1998. And then there was, 2/3 of Latin America was under some form of leftist rule in the, early 2000s through roughly 2012 to 2015. An extraordinary period. There was a lot of successes, but there was also problems. And I think some of what we're seeing now speaks to some of the unresolved contradictions of the pink tide. There was a resource dependency, which was obviously very visible in Venezuela. There was all sorts of contradictions in terms of the economic sort of decision making and the economic projects that were being put forward. There was discussion of socialism of the 21st century in places like Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia. There was some progress towards that in Venezuela, and that led to a really big pushback of domestic elites, and then also, foreign corporations, the U.S. government. But it was a very uneven project. There was no way we could say that anything approaching socialism was consolidated in Venezuela or anywhere else. And after Chavez died in 2013, Maduro took office. A whole series of things started to go wrong in Venezuela. One of them was the price of oil started to go down. And that was, partly a U.S. policy. They were, fracking in the U.S. They were deliberately trying to drive down the price of oil for a period of time. There's other factors as well, dropping demand from China. So it wasn't just the U.S. doing what it wanted. So Maduro gets, elected. And it's important to note he was indeed elected in 2013. But there's a really big economic crisis. Some of that has to do with the problems of the pink tide within Venezuela. There's minutia that we could get into, but probably don't have time today. But currency policy was a major one. Continued oil dependency was another one. And then massive corruption that was, an endemic problem within Venezuela, but got worse under Chavez and got really, really bad under Maduro. And then on top of that, there was increasing U.S. sanctions, which actually started under Obama in a very limited and sort of targeted fashion, but had a broader impact because of the over-compliance issue where corporations don't want to do business with Venezuela because of the threat to their reputation. So people have talked about this as not just sanctions, but the toxification of Venezuela's debt, the toxification of Venezuela's economy. And then under Trump, Trump won, that is, the sanctions got onto steroids. And so this destroyed Venezuela's economy. I mean, I think without a doubt, we can say that there's multiple factors that caused Venezuela's economy to start to deteriorate from 2013, even 2012 onwards. But it's U.S. sanctions really biting under Trump 1 in 2017, 2018, 2019 that prevented Venezuela from having any chance of recovering. And that led to the sort of opening of an authoritarian turn within Venezuela. Not an opening, but a sort of consolidation of an authoritarian turn. Although, it's complicated because Maduro was facing this massive U.S. pressure, massive pressure from the opposition, which had certainly not always played by democratic rules. But nonetheless, there was a clear authoritarian turn within Venezuela, an escalation of U.S. pressure under Trump in his first administration, the Juan Guaido debacle in 2019, where you have a self-declared president trying to incite a military invasion. And one of the things it speaks to is that Maduro, through all of this, was really successful in terms of maintaining power. He did not succumb to the sanctions. He did not succumb to Juan Guaido. He did not succumb to any sort of rumors within the military. He seemed to have a lock on the military. And that seemed to continue through, last night, basically. I mean, I think if you talk to Venezuela experts until midnight last night, they would have said the Venezuelan military is pretty solidly behind Maduro. There was no public signs of any crack, of any split. Obviously, now we know that wasn't entirely the case. There must have been some military factions, some within Maduro's inner circle as well.
Sure seems that way.
Yeah, I mean, this couldn't have gone down. This is not a totally peaceful coup, but it's a relatively, limited bloodshed, we could say. As of now, there's been, 40 casualties, which is not a huge amount in, compared to Allende and the Argentine dirty war in the 1970s, of course. But, Maduro, he was really successful for a long time, but the pressure, we can get to the last couple months now, maybe, and the pressure in the last couple months has been relentless. And, it took a couple of forms. Of course, there was the boat bombing campaign, which has, domestic roots in terms of Trump's immigration policy and the desire to sort of deport Venezuelans and whip up anti-immigrant sort of hysteria within the United States. There's this long-standing project Marco Rubio has for regime change in Cuba in particular, but Venezuela was another sort of piece on the way to getting to Cuba. So Rubio is obviously jubilant at the outcome today. And I'm sure he's not done. He wants Cuba and he wants regime change within Cuba. And then you had the acts of piracy, the U.S. basically going and seizing Venezuelan oil tankers. And I'm not sure, but it's interesting to note the timing of the operation against Maduro and what's been happening literally in the last few days, where I think there was one oil tanker that was seized in early December. There's a second one that was attempted to be seized. I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, but the second one that wasn't fully seized, has been evading capture and, evading kidnapping. Piracy is the only way to really describe it. And the Russian government indicated that they were going to take over the boat and provide it with a certain degree of protection. And that was happening right in the last day or two. So it seems possible that the Trump administration realized that this campaign of seizing Venezuela's oil tankers as a way to economically strangle Venezuela and just put unremitting pressure on Maduro and others around Maduro to say, look, if you stick with Maduro, we're going to destroy your economy in a way that's just going to make life impossible. It's possible that with the Russian sort of, takeover, assistance to this distressed oil tanker, that the Trump administration said, well, maybe that's not going to be as fast. Maybe that's not going to work the way we thought. But obviously, this operation must have been going on for some time. There was some planning. It's really extraordinary. I mean, I think that above all else, just the facts, 2 things are just still making me reel from the news. One, that Trump actually tried this. And the reason that's surprising is that despite everything, he has seemed to have an aversion to sort of actual military engagements and the possibility of boots on the ground. And this really went well beyond that. I mean, this is a clear, incredibly aggressive military operation. And then the fact that it succeeded is also kind of stunning. Given that Maduro was able to evade all sorts of pressure up until now, the fact that this went so quickly and relatively smoothly, although I think we do not want to underplay the casualties or the chaos that could be happening in Venezuela over the next couple of days, the possibility for further bloodshed, and the uncertainty. But nonetheless, this was it seems like a pretty smooth operation. They got what they wanted, that is the Trump administration. And then there's huge questions about what comes next that, I think are hard to answer, but really important to speculate on.
So just one question before I'm going to throw it to Derek. But as sort of historians, was there a counterfactual world where the pink tide or the leftward turn turned out differently? Or can we see now from the perspective of the later 2020s that this sort of resource dependency and just being in the United States' hemisphere makes these types of projects very difficult to succeed? A bit of a sort of like counterfactual theoretical question, but I feel like this does feel like the end of something. So I thought it might be appropriate to ask, and then Derek, off to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think one thing that I think is important in historical perspective, it's sort of a conjunctural, thing that it's hard to sort of think about it even theoretically, although we can try, is Chavez's death. Certainly thinking, and I think that's important for Venezuela, obviously, but also for the left turn as a whole. Chavez was the president elected who set off the left turn, set off the pink tide in 1998. He was a crucial figure in Latin American politics, despite efforts by the U.S. to sort of, divide him from Lula in Brazil. He and Lula were buddies until the very end. They had this, really impressive regional Latin American unity project. It took various organizational forms, UNASUR, or the Union of South American Nations, which excluded the United States. And there were some other organizations that also did that. Meant that Latin America was achieving a degree of autonomy. Chavez was also able to hold together domestically. He was able to hold together many different factions within Venezuela, including the national bourgeoisie or factions of the national bourgeoisie, and certainly the military, revolutionary, social movements in a way that Maduro never was able to do. And I think that Chavez had this incredible legitimacy that was undeniable for even U.S. policymakers. And so there was no way, in 2014, when Maduro had U.S.-supported protests that were very violent against him for months, that wouldn't have happened under Chavez. And so, the price of oil, very well could have gone down as well. But I think Chavez would have maneuvered in a more skillful manner. That doesn't mean that what we sort of saw with a right turn happening in Brazil, happening in Honduras a couple of years earlier, happening in Chile and other countries in Latin America, that could have easily happened. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's the sort of frustration with the inability of the sort of pink tide governments to actually deliver all of their promises. There's the resource base and the changes in the global economy. And some of those factors meant that they weren't able to overcome some of the contradictions of the process. This was an electoral process, so it wasn't a revolutionary process. You still had, well-funded, powerful oppositions that didn't go away and that were ready to take advantage. In Chile now we have basically a supporter of Pinochet literally coming back into the presidency after decades there of having much more mild forms of right wing and various forms of left wing government. So all of those contradictions would have been there. But I do think that in a world where Chavez had lived, maybe, I think Brazil's the other important case. Maybe if the coup in Brazil hadn't happened, I'm not sure that Chavez's being alive would have prevented that. But there's a series of things that could have gone a little bit differently, and they might have slightly changed things. I also want to just note that there's a second pink tide that is still happening right now. So it's by no means fully over. The idea that there's a right turn is true. I mean, we can see that in Chile, we can see that in Bolivia, we can see that in other places. But Gustavo Petro in Colombia is one expression of the sort of pink tide 2.0, if you will. Scheinbaum and AMLO in Mexico, which is, I think, probably the most successful current case of left governance in the world. And, certainly in Latin America is another case. There's a few other countries that have, various forms of leftist government as well. And so the left turn hasn't totally gone away, but it certainly has come under major sort of strain. And Gustavo Petro is not going to be reelected in Colombia. And so, the right consolidation and then the Trump administration's just agenda of outright dominance is going to be really hard for them to deal with.
So, Gabriel, I think that leads very neatly into the big question here, which is what does this augur for the U.S. in Latin America moving forward? We did a little brief special yesterday just to talk about the main details of what happened. And Danny made the comparison, and I know I've seen other people make the comparison between this operation and the operation to take out Manuel Noriega. I think there are a number of differences that make this operation stand out as something unique and unprecedented. But among them, leaving aside the logistical elements or the details surrounding these two events, is that the U.S. has always traditionally been happy to do sort of direct intervention against tiny Central American states. It has not, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, been as keen to do that in large South American states. It's preferred to work with domestic proxies, with military juntas, with other, actors within those countries to achieve the outcomes that it wants when it tries to intervene. And so this seems like something new and dangerous to me, that we're now carrying out operations like this in a country like Venezuela.
Yeah, I think that's an astute analysis. I mean, if we just think about some of the examples in the past, Allende in Chile, that was a covert operation that the U.S. was not directly even sending U.S. warplanes. I mean, the U.S. was very involved in it, but was behind the scenes. Same thing in Argentina with the Dirty War, even Guatemala, in 1954 with Arbenz. So, there's a long history, of course, of U.S. intervention in Latin America against, progressive, nationalist, leftist presidents, elected presidents. And there's some differences. I mean, the fact that, Venezuela is a country of roughly 30 million people, it's hard to know the exact population with some of the out-migration recently, but it's much larger, as you've said, than Central American countries that, the U.S. has gone into. And the U.S. also hasn't done any direct sort of military interventions of this nature. I think you might have to go back to Aristide in Haiti for the most recent case of U.S. direct sort of military intervention. And so it's extraordinary. It's really disturbing. It's just an assertion of raw U.S. military power in a way that does not augur well for Latin America overall. And there's been outright threats to Colombia, for instance, and Gustavo Petro. I mean, Trump, using really crude language, has told Petro, I think he said, like, watch your ass, or, something vulgar like that. And has, fairly directly said that, the U.S. has its eye on Colombia. I haven't really heard any active planning, so I don't know that there's a whole lot of real threat there. There's an election, as I mentioned, so the right could easily be back in power in Colombia soon enough anyway. So the idea that the U.S. would actually do that seems a little far-fetched, but they've threatened to do that, and this certainly sends the message to Latin America as a whole that the U.S. is willing to use its power in the most naked ways. And it's not just military power. I mean, I guess we can take a step back and say the U.S. is willing to use its economic and military power in very direct, unmasked, naked ways in Latin America today. And we saw that in Argentina, where Trump's, Treasury Secretary, I think it was $40 billion that they pumped into the Argentine economy before an election to help the president. The president wasn't up for election, but it was lower level election, and it helped Javier Milei, who's a far right leader. The U.S. has, strongly supported the dictator in El Salvador, Bukele. Has helped Bolsonaro in Brazil, and threatened Lula and threatened Brazil as well in very direct ways around tariffs and things like that. But of course,
handpicked the winner of the Honduran presidential election. Yes. I mean,
exactly. And so the direct interference without any pretense. It's people keep saying Trump says the quiet part out loud, and it's true. He really does, in astonishing, stunning, and dangerous ways. I mean, I think it's profoundly dangerous for Latin America and for the world. And there is something specific about Latin America. I mean, there's Trump repeatedly mentioning the Monroe Doctrine. So, Danny, to the historical thing, Trump is referencing this, important historical document over and over again, talking about the Monroe Doctrine, which is, the Trump sort of corollary towards it. And that basically means the U.S. will directly do whatever it wants to help its friends in Latin America and to punish its enemies. But there's this real pivot towards Latin America and the Western Hemisphere overall that is just incredibly dangerous and incredibly disturbing to see happening.
Let's talk a little bit about the legal aspect of this. And I know, we're all on somewhat shaky ground here. None of us is an international lawyer, but this is flagrant, right? I mean, this is just a flagrant violation of not just international law, of U.S. law, especially to the extent that you can consider international treaties to which the United States is a party, like the UN Charter, which this grossly violates, as matters of domestic U.S. law as well. Like this is an illegal act under, and sort of any way you slice it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I believe Ilhan Omar has, tweeted out some stuff today criticizing this and basically saying that, just domestically, that Trump is not using congressional authorization whatsoever, and therefore there needs to be a War Powers Act, War Powers Resolution to try to constrain that and force Trump to do that. I think that, we don't want to single out Trump entirely here because U.S. presidents of both parties have done this for a long time, acting without congressional authorization, but it's illegal no matter who does it. If Biden does it,
and it's a procedural dodge. And I like Ilhan Omar. Don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing her for this, but Democrats do this all the time. They say you can't do that unless you cross you fill out the form in triplicate and cross the T's. Congress can vote for an illegal war. Like Congress could give authorization to a president to break treaties and violate international law or violate U.S. law. It doesn't. This isn't like a blank check that could be handed to a president if he only went and asked the right people for permission. Like that's still that wouldn't make this right. If he had gone to Congress and gotten a war powers resolution or whatever they're looking for, that would not have made this a legal operation, in my view.
No, I totally agree. And the proceduralism of the Democrats is frustrating because, as you're pointing out, it's just sort of, oh, is it okay if we get congressional authorization to do something that is blatantly illegal under international law? Of course not. And indeed, the most striking fact of this that, again, Trump's not even hiding is the violation of national sovereignty, Venezuela's national sovereignty. I can't remember the exact wording, but in his press conference, he said it was an attack on sovereignty. He literally used that language in his press conference this morning. So again, we're speaking on Saturday. So he did the press conference earlier Saturday morning. And, it's almost like they're proud of the fact that they are violating international law. They're not worried about it in any respect whatsoever. And so this is, just part of the Trump administration being, gleeful about violating domestic and international law. And they're really, they just want to say we're going to do whatever we want and nobody can stop us.
Let's talk about what is going to happen in Venezuela, or what's likely to happen. And first, I guess maybe, talk a little bit about Delcy Rodriguez, if she's the person who's in charge now, and maybe the person in charge under, and we can get to this, under some U.S. Overlordship. Who is she, and do you find anything believable in some of the claims that have been made that she may have been the person who was worked out, inside the administration, who was dealing with the Trump administration, or among the people who made a deal to get rid of Maduro in return for staying in power?
Yeah, so Delcy Rodriguez is, one of the highest level officials within the now, deposed Maduro administration, has been high level for, going back to Chavez's time, so over a decade now. And she's been very close to Maduro throughout the time. But I think it's important to note that, the entire upper echelons of the Maduro administration over the last, I would say, certainly the last 5 years, but, we could say 6, 7, 8 years or so, quibbling over some of the details of that. But they've really lost any ideological credibility to be leftist in any sense or progressive in any sense. I mean, they have embraced a series of neoliberal policies that some people would defend as, necessary sort of steps to defend the revolution, but they haven't actually accompanied that with any real moves to defend the population of Venezuela or defend the revolution or take steps to actually do that. So I think that speaks to the sort of ideological vacancy of the Maduro administration for a number of years at the very least. And that is important because this is not a set of, officials, including Delcy Rodriguez, who have shown that they believe in anything other than staying in power, other than saving their own skin. And so I think that is the number one most important thing to take into consideration right now, that all of the various top level officials within Venezuela, including Maduro, just wanted to save their own skin for a long, long time. And now it seems like they're probably willing to get rid of Maduro, give the U.S. access to oil in order to save their skin. And so it would appear likely, given Trump's statement sort of sidelining explicitly Maria Corina Machado, that they are going to allow Delcy Rodriguez and, the upper echelons of the Maduro administration to stay in power for now, but they are going to be incredibly constrained. They know that there's a sort of, threat of military intervention explicitly made by Trump today. He said, this was our first military engagement within Venezuela, and we have a second one that we've planned and that we can do. And that is credible, given what they've just done. And so, they'll have that threat hanging over them. And so they're very likely to do Trump's bidding to a large extent. And I think from the Trump point of view, what was, sort of attractive about leaving in place some of the Maduro people, which they're going to be criticized for. They're going to say, what kind of change is this? You got rid of Maduro, but everyone around him is still there. How can you claim that this is a free or new Venezuela? They're probably willing to do that because they don't want a totally messy, prolonged, Vietnam or Iraq style conflict of bloody, chaos and armed forces from different sort of factions on the ground. There's a lot of armed actors in Venezuela. There's a lot of illegal gold mining. There's a lot of all sorts of, corruption within the government. The military obviously is armed, of course. And so, if you don't have a stable government that can take over now, it would be a mess. And I think Trump wants Maduro out, but I don't think he wants the mess. And for now, it kind of looks like that's what Delcy Rodriguez gets him. And she, in turn, gets to not, be killed, not be deposed, not have to go into some, jail situation or hiding or exile. But it's a really tricky situation, to put it mildly. I mean, she is under tremendous constraint. It's basically, if she doesn't do the Trump administration's bidding in economic policy and other things like that, she will, face tremendous pressure. On the other hand, it's not clear what she would stand for other than saving herself and saving her own skin. And I think this is not just her. This is true of, the upper ranks of the Maduro administration overall.
It's, the question then it becomes like, does this buy you a stable government? Like, I just don't see that being the case. I don't know. I mean, I know The Guardian published a piece a few weeks ago about these war games that the U.S. military did during Trump won, about what might happen if Maduro were to be ousted or to leave Venezuela. And I don't think kidnapping him in the middle of the night with Delta Force was one of the scenarios that they gamed out. But the result in all of them was fragmentation. It was the rise of factions in the countryside, fragmentation maybe in the military, but basically chaos and violence across the country. And I don't know how you avoid that in this scenario. Like Trump talks about running Venezuela. That means running Caracas to me, or running Caracas and a couple other major cities and maybe a couple of oil sites. But it doesn't mean that you're going to have stable control and law and order across Venezuela, or that he even cares about that, or anybody in his administration even cares about that. It just feels like inevitable at this point that you're going to have a worsening of what was already, as you alluded to, already a fairly unstable situation in large parts of the country.
Yeah, I think that, one of the big questions in my mind is what's going to happen with U.S. sanctions policy, because that has been just utterly devastating for Venezuela's economy for years and years. And there's been slight recovery, within Venezuela's economy over the last couple of years. It's been uneven. It's been sort of back and forth. But it had, until the last 3 or 4 months, I would say it had been getting better compared to the very worst years. I mean, you saw economic growth for a couple of years in a row. We should take stock of the massive damage to Venezuela's economy. I mean, the most reliable estimates suggest that between roughly 2012 and 2020, 74% of GDP was lost cumulatively, which is, the largest collapse in Latin American history. It's one of the largest collapse of a peacetime economy in world history. It's just utterly stunning and, fairly unprecedented in many ways. And there was, again, some recovery of that, but U.S. sanctions and the more recent actions of the seizing of Venezuelan oil tankers was getting in the way. So one question, I guess, is if the U.S. government now says, okay, we have a government we can accept that they're doing our bidding. If they're willing to say that, and I'm not sure, I think I'll come back to that in a second. If they were willing to say that, they could then say, okay, well, we're going to get rid of the sanctions. We're going to, invest a lot of money, U.S. corporations within Venezuela. That could have one sort of stabilizing effect on a macro level. It could get companies going back to Venezuela. I'm not sure how much it would help ordinary Venezuelans, because obviously Trump has no interest in helping ordinary Venezuelans, and the people running Venezuela's government don't either, and they haven't for a long time. So, even if you had some macro level economic stability, things could still be really dire for average Venezuelans in Caracas, as well as the millions who are outside of Venezuela right now. The problem, I think, and you are probably thinking of this already, Derek, that is Trump going to be willing to say that this is a fully acceptable government? and therefore we can get rid of the sanctions. I don't know. I mean, they're going to be facing criticism from some of the far right, Cuban American and Venezuelan American Republicans in Florida and elsewhere. Even Marco Rubio, who's deeply tied to that political faction in that community, probably won't be crazy about having former Maduro high-ranking officials running Venezuela. And therefore, are they going to be willing to lift the U.S. sanctions and really sort of quote unquote normalize Venezuela? And then there's one other problem with all of this, which is that there is an opposition represented by Maria Corina Machado, and they're going to be pissed. And they are not totally insignificant. I mean, they have some degree of political force, especially outside of Venezuela. And so they're going to be screaming in the ears of EU officials. They're going to be screaming in the ears of any officials in the US government that they can get a hold of. And they could provide some pressure against any normalization. They don't want that to happen. I mean, it's hard to imagine, that Maduro's exit could be the worst case scenario for Maria Corina Machado, but it might actually be, and if that's the case, then she's going to just do everything she can to thwart the success of this new sort of project. And then there's all the different groups within Venezuela who have been existing in some degree of, it's not really stability, but they've been existing in some fashion or other within Venezuela for a number of years, many different sort of corrupt elements within the business community, the military, even popular sector corruption to some extent. And they're going to be worried, really, really worried about what's happening now. And so I think it would take an incredible amount of discipline and skill and diplomacy to actually pull something off. And Trump and, even Maduro has not shown, or the people around Maduro, I should say, they have not shown an ability to actually do that. What unifies the current project if it's just saving ourselves on the part of the Venezuelan government, so to speak, right now, and then looting Venezuela? I mean, that's what Trump says he wants to do. If he just wants to plunder Venezuela openly, that's not going to stabilize it. If he wants to use all of Venezuela's resources to help the U.S. to make sure this is a no-cost operation, that is not going to lead to stability within Venezuela. So I think that, there's one really, really over-optimistic scenario you can imagine where everything kind of goes right in terms of stability and ending the sanctions and Venezuela gets off the ground. But it's hard to imagine all of those things actually happening. And so I think that the pressures for chaos and for, even armed conflict in the coming weeks and months are going to be immense, immense, immense. And it's just an incredibly dangerous situation.
I think that last point is key, because even if the sanctions come off, what we've seen all the messaging out of the administration so far, and this goes back weeks to when Trump was raving about oil nationalization in the 70s, is that the intention here is to strip Venezuela bare, like to take everything out of it that we can get. I mean, you've got to have, like, the board of directors of Chevron is probably, if those guys weren't on the phone ordering hookers and blow, immediately when they heard about this, I don't know what to tell you. But like, they've got to be thrilled. This is, 300 billion, barrels of oil or whatever the reserves are in Venezuela that is open for business now. This is the Wall Street Journal reported today, I mean, as this was unfolding, that there are already hedge funds and asset managers preparing a trip to Venezuela to scout out how they can take whatever isn't nailed down, what they can extract from this country. Like, this is economically a potential disaster, even if the sanctions do come off. And the sanctions have been a disaster. But, even if Trump were to lift them tomorrow, if the country's going to be stripped bare, what have the Venezuelan people actually gained from this?
Yeah, I think that's a fundamentally important point. And I think that it also speaks to the contradictions from the point of view of the Trump administration itself. This is an incredibly short-sighted project, and their overall outlook is obviously, it's one of plunder domestically, it's one of plunder internationally as well. But that is not a formula for stability. At the risk of stating the obvious, this is not a project for hegemony. This is a project for crude economic and military domination that has no pretense of legitimacy. And therefore, the stability of it, the long-term durability of it, is going to be constantly undermined by the project itself. As you strip Venezuela of all of its assets, of all of its resources, you're going to keep a population utterly immiserated. That's going to continue the outmigration of Venezuelans, which has been destabilizing. Of course, some of that Trump will be totally happy with. I mean, having a major sort of migration crisis is something he'll be able to point to and say, look, this is a problem we need to fix, we need to fight it. And, so he'll be thrilled on one level around that. But Latin American countries, I think, will not be entirely thrilled. At some point, even the right-wing regimes in Latin America could be upset with some of the sort of chaos. And then just the larger possibility of the U.S. going after other countries, I think, will also just be destabilizing more broadly within Latin America specifically and within the world as well. So, the ingredients for a chaotic and just incredibly fluid and dangerous situation are right there.
I do want to come back to that because you alluded to this earlier, but I want to come back to this, the regional question. And now the thing that has to be on the minds of, Petro and Miguel Diaz-Canel in Cuba, and even Claudia Sheinbaum, who's suddenly, getting the same rhetorical treatment from the Trump administration that, she's not really running the country. It's the cartels that are running Mexico. Like, there's a really good possibility here because Donald Trump has the attention span of a Cocker Spaniel, that he's going to see this operation, and it went so smoothly in the just initial, and I don't want to talk about the occupation or what's to come because there's all manner of things that are going to go wrong with this, but just the way that it came off in the moment and become so enamored of this, we can just go in and kidnap any world leader we want, or any at least Western Hemisphere leader that we want, that this is going to be the big thing now, that this is the threat that's now hanging over all of these guys. And, I agree, like, it would be really daft to do this to Petro because you could get what you want in an election in a few months. But Cuba, Mexico, other places where, you're not 100% on board, this is easily something that he could try to replicate in other places.
Yeah, I think Cuba is the place where it's the most likely. And that is, has a lot to do with Marco Rubio, of course. He has had his eye on Cuba and regime change in Cuba forever. And he is deeply, deeply committed to trying to realize that goal. And he'll see this as a real opportunity. So I think that we will see absolutely an escalation of threats against Cuba. There's also the fact that there was an economic relationship and, of course, a political and military relationship between Venezuela and Cuba. And that cuts a number of different ways. I mean, just think of Cuba for a second. They have gotten a lot of oil from Venezuela for a number of years. That has had a stabilizing economic impact. They've actually sold Venezuelan oil on the open market and used that for, hard currency that they use for all sorts of things within Cuba. They're not going to have that anymore. It's hard to imagine that the overlords in the Trump administration are going to allow Delcy Rodriguez to continue shipping Venezuelan oil to Cuba at an incredibly discounted rate or at any rate whatsoever. And so that seems like it'll be a major threat. There'll be direct threats against Cuba. On the Venezuelan side, Cuba has provided a lot of security and military advising for many, many years. And that's been pretty crucial. And so that will go away as soon as the economic relationship between Venezuela and Cuba goes away, which is to say immediately probably. And that will probably have a somewhat destabilizing effect within the military. I mean, it's hard to sort of say, but there's lots of Venezuelan, military figures who are connected in various ways to the Cuban military and the Cuban sort of state. And those relationships are not going to be there anymore. And so there's just going to be a lot of challenges. And then, as you said, Derek, I think that, I'm just imagining as you're saying this, that the Trump administration will almost surely, even if they don't do stuff, which I don't think we can discount, they will almost surely threaten to do stuff in other countries when elections are happening. They'll say it in Colombia. They'll say it over and over for the next election that, if you elect the successor to Gustavo Petro, this guy, Ivan Cepeda, who's, has a surprising amount of momentum as the leftist candidate within Colombia right now, they'll say, if you elect him, we're going to depose him. We're going to go after him. We're going to keep our eye on him. If he does something wrong, we might do that. And other elections that are coming up in Latin America as well. I think that the Colombian one is maybe the most important one in the next year, but in a few years' time, there'll be important ones in other countries in Latin America also. And it's very easy to imagine that the Trump administration will make those threats explicitly, and that will have some potential impact. I mean, that's democracy under the threat of foreign intervention. You have a gun to your head. This is what we saw. A classic case, of course, is Nicaragua in 1990, where, the U.S. explicitly said, you vote for the Sandinistas, we're going to continue the Contra war. You don't, and we're going to, stop it. And the anti-Sandinista candidate won that election, but it clearly wasn't free and fair with that kind of threat. And so this is another, just horrific development that, we'll have to watch and try to figure out ways to mitigate as best as possible. But it's really, really atrocious.
Just a final question before we let you go, Gabriel. Have you heard anything from, in and around Washington, D.C., Latin American hands, what they have been saying? Because I imagine the foreign policy establishment, the sort of bureaucratic establishment is different than the coalition that Rubio, who I imagine is the one behind this, represents. But have you heard anything from that perspective, with sort of the mainstream, quote unquote, center of the foreign policy establishment, their opinions on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't delved as far into it as I normally did. I was a little busy out and about today to fully get into Twitter is where I follow some of those people. But I've seen a little bit of people are concerned. They're worried. So I don't think that there's a total support for this. There's a sense that, this is scary. This is not, not entirely certain. Although I think that, not the DC one, but I think it's probably kind of similar. Macron, for instance, so the French president, who's, somewhat similar ideological outlook as some of the mainstream DC foreign policy folks, sort of welcomed in an apprehensive way that Maduro's gone, but then said he was pointing to Edmundo Gonzalez, who's the person who, by all accounts won the election and is basically a figurehead for Machado. And he was saying he should become the president. And I would say that if you asked Venezuelans on the street, that would probably be most people might say that. And so I would imagine that a lot of the DC folks are, worried that something like that is not happening. But I haven't delved into it as much as possible. I think that the little that I've seen suggests that there's some jitteriness about it. The one thing I did see, just some sort of inner stuff is that when Delcy Rodriguez was having her press conference, apparently someone pointed out that she hadn't mentioned Diosdado Cabello, who was the interior minister and a very, very powerful figure. Some people thought of him as the number 2 to Maduro, and apparently wasn't mentioned in the press conference, which would be kind of extraordinary unless he's been arrested and is leaving because he's such a powerful figure. So, that just speaks to the sense of, uncertainty about what could happen. I think that, going back to some of the other questions you were raising, Derek, there's a lot of different people under Maduro, and Maduro was, he was the president. He was the guy for so long, but with him gone, some of those power struggles amongst the, officials right below him could erupt. And if there's people who feel like they've been cut out by Rubio and Trump and Rodriguez, we could also see some things happening there. So this doesn't directly answer your question, Danny, but I think it just speaks to the worries that some of the people have right now, that there's just so much uncertainty with what's going on. What I haven't seen from the DC circuit, so to speak, is a condemnation of the imperialism. I mean, I think that you're seeing more of the procedural stuff and the worry about what's happening. But I think that, we need to say the U.S. has no right to do this. The U.S., regardless of the mess in Venezuela, which the U.S. had a big part in creating, we just have to oppose any form of raw imperial power such as this. It's just problematic and unacceptable in so many ways. And I think that has to always be front and center in conversations like this.
I just don't know how much longer the international law people or the rules-based order people can get away with this shit, like can get away with pretending to uphold these principles. And yet at the drop of a hat, when the US does something like this, as you say, they're either outright praising it, as I think some of them did today. I mean, there was some praise from the good old rules-based order DC types for ousting Maduro, because of course he's a horrible dictator and he has to be, the Venezuelan people deserve better, blah blah blah. It's the same bullshit every time. But at the very most, if there's an objection, it comes in the form of these proceduralist bullshit things. And yet the next time Vladimir Putin decides to invade a satellite, a country on Russia's periphery, or the next time China does war games around Taiwan, these same people will be back out talking about, national sovereignty and international law and the rules. You can't break the rules. Like, fuck off. Like, I can't take this shit anymore. Like, it's so obvious that none of you believe this shit. Just stop talking about it. That's where I'm at mentally. And I guess, being a week into the flu is probably affecting my mental outlook somewhat. But it's just like this one above all, like it's so lawless. It is so far beyond the pale that if you can't now say this is too much, the United States should not be engaged in something like this, it's illegitimate, then just shut up. Like, just stop talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with the rant. Well said. And I think that it speaks to maybe something we can wonder if there's room for optimism, although I honestly don't feel it right now. But, as a liberal international order, which was always flimsy and contradictory and BS in so many ways, as it crumbles and as it visibly crumbles, maybe that provides an opening for a more full-throated anti-imperialism to just say that, it's not just because of procedures, it's not just because of the sort of violation of certain norms, but it's because it's fundamentally wrong for, more powerful states to just do whatever the hell they want to less powerful states. That's just not okay. That's not the world that we want. It's bullying. It's just an unacceptable state of affairs that we need to oppose every single time we get the chance to oppose it. And we need to figure out more effective ways to oppose it. I mean, I think that's the other tragedy, going way back to something you were asking about earlier, Danny, that there was a real anti-imperial bloc within Latin America when Chavez and Lula were, doing UNASUR. And that's one of the things that, prevented the U.S. from doing coups in Bolivia in 2008. I mean, they were sort of on, pulling the trigger practically in 2008, and in Venezuela and other times and various places. There was a lot of pushback, a unified pushback from many leftist governments within Latin America. And that is mostly gone. It's not entirely gone. I mean, you still have Petro and Lula and Sheinbaum, three really big countries. I mean, obviously Mexico and Brazil are huge, and Colombia is an important country as well. And so you still have some of that, but you don't have the unified sort of anti-imperialist sort of stance. And that's, speaking to that earlier thing. So maybe, again, maybe optimistically, there's a possibility for a just more robust, not strictly speaking, proceduralism form of anti-imperialism. I don't think the proceduralism itself is wrong per se. I mean, I think what's wrong about it is that it doesn't actually represent anything other than proceduralism. I mean, having a full-throated anti-imperialism and a proceduralism, having a real international order. I mean, this is like what Gandhi said, I think, about civilization. It's a great idea. It'd be wonderful if we had it. It'd be wonderful if we did have rules-based international order. That is necessary. That would be, useful. This is what Latin America, Greg Brannon has this, huge book, America, that I think you guys have interviewed him about a couple times. And, Latin America has been pushing for a genuine international rules-based order for a very long time. And we still need it. And this is so clear in light of what's happening now. But we need, we don't just need procedures. We need a real political force to stop bullies from doing whatever they want.
And maybe end on a note of optimism here. There's actually, as people listen to this podcast know, I'm skeptical that left-right was a very effective way to understand U.S. politics, except for maybe parts of the middle to late 20th century. But there actually is a deep-rooted anti-imperialist tradition here. Unfortunately, it was often tinged with very racist sentiments, but it was at least anti-imperialist, and maybe we could build a sort of renewed anti-imperialism that is not as tinged with extreme xenophobia and extreme racism, but could be a genuinely anti-imperialist movement. I think that was one of Mike Davis's final messages: anti-imperialism now and anti-imperialism forever. But on that note, Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, thank you so much for listening, and we will keep on updating you about this Venezuelan situation as things proceed. Bye.